So hi, welcome friends to our first episode of Day Out with a Human Star. I'm Chandra Kishore, founder of Indian Environment Network, and the website is paryavaran.com. We have been connecting environment organizations all over the world with Indian environment professionals for the last 20 years. And we have members from like more than 2,000 organizations. So check us at envindia.com or paryavaran.com. So what we are most excited today is launching this new initiative that we have, and that is called dayoutwith.com. It directly connects leaders, scientists, and professionals with the actual people. So what is happening is that there are two main reasons for starting this website. One is to spread awareness about important scientific issues like climate change. Everyone knows about it. Make sure that we are getting facts directly from the scientists. And yes, break the glass ceiling that exists between scientists and professionals and the general people, and have them directly connect with each other. To introduce you today, Dr. Prakash Kashwan. Dr. Kashwan, we chose him as our first human star, not because he's just another scientist, because just last month he came up with a very important book, Democracy with the Woods. I'll tell you more about it, but let me first tell you something about Dr. Kashwan. Dr. Prakash Kashwan, he received his PhD in public policy from Indiana University, Bloomington, and received his mentorship directly under Dr. Elinor Ostrom. You know about her, right? 2009 Nobel Prize winner in economics. So she was the mentor for Dr. Prakash Kashwan. Dr. Kashwan is now assistant professor at University of Connecticut. And he has been published in a lot of journals right now. There are like Journal of Environmental Management, Economics, Environmental Change, Land Use Policy, a lot of them. I won't bore you with everything that he has done. But the most important thing is he came up with this book, Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico, which was published by Oxford University Press just like in January. And the most important thing is that the book, the first print was already sold out. So they have to come up with a second print right now, I think. What this book does is that it presents a unique approach to answering questions about environmental protection and social justice by considering the role of land rights and everything else. I'll read you all the praise about these books, but first I just wanted to go to Prakash and just introduce you to him. Hey Prakash, it's so great to have you with us. And I'll just start with you. Just tell me a little about yourself.
Thank you, CK, for having me and for this, kind, generous introduction. And as you kind of noted, the book's agenda is especially relevant to the contemporary political, economic, and environmental context. And I'm glad we are talking about this. But before I get into this, let me also welcome and thank Irina, Nishad, Mawa, and Ilona. Irina, I think, is yet to join us. And Matthew, I hope he'll also join us. So thank you all very much for your time and for your engagement here. As you said, I've been working on these issues for a very, very long time. And even before I came to academia, between 1999 and 2005, I was working with non-governmental organizations and international donor agencies to assist communities who are, grappling with the same set of questions. And what I observed in that work for about 6 years was that, environmental question is inextricably linked to the questions of land rights and questions of social justice. So you don't necessarily have to sort of, theoretically combine them and link them in your analytical frameworks. On the ground, these questions are already connected. But
like, what motivated you to have this book?
So as I said, while I was working on these interventions on the ground, we whoever we were partnering with, all of us were sort of short of answers about how to combine these competing agendas of environmental conservation and social justice. These questions are important because these contestations speak to some of the most fundamental questions that political scientists and other social scientists care about. And to briefly give you an idea of what these conflicts are about, while many indigenous and other forest-dependent people use forest and forest lands for farming, pasturing, and other subsistence purposes, many other, such as the people who care about environmental conservation and biodiversity conservation and wildlife and so forth, many of them, not all of them, but many of them want to keep the forest exclusively for these goals of wildlife and biodiversity conservation. So please note that my emphasis is on the exclusive nature of the wildlife and biodiversity management that some of these actors and agencies demand. Which is problematic for a number of reasons that are not always discussed in the popular domain. I'll try to explain these reasons.
Prakash, before we go deep into what this book is about, let me ask you one thing. First time I interviewed you was in relation to the Nobel Prize that Dr. Elinor got. So let me ask you, did her work influence your book? How did it work out?
Absolutely. Professor Ostrom, who was known as Lynn, she taught us how to frame very complex questions in a way which allows for a robust inquiry and investigation. And she taught us how to bridge different kinds of theories and methods, which are often seen not just in the popular realm, but also in academia, which are often seen not to belong together in a single research or scholarship. So and one has to do that without losing track of the outcomes of interest. So you don't get carried away with all of the theoretical work and leave aside the big questions and end up focusing on a very narrow question. So she taught how to do this in whatever questions you may be examining. Now, she, in her own research, she looked at particular kind of questions, but when she taught us, she didn't, force us to do the same kind of research that she was doing. So she was great at promoting interdisciplinary research, promoting at research that would be useful in the real world and in the real policy context. And she would have been extremely happy to see this book.
Yeah,
if she was
the book examines the role of democracy in negotiating the contradictions between environmental protection and social justice goals. So I had a question. Why did you select India, Tanzania, and Mexico?
Right. So I was going to get to that question, but for a moment, let me sort of bring us back a little bit and explain the sort of, the framing of this particular question that I'm asking. So when an average urban dweller who doesn't do research on these questions, when they hear about the word forest, the imagery that comes to their mind is of a pristine and wildlife landscape with the zebras and lions and elephants roaming around, and not a human in sight, to the extent that you can see. And this is an imagery that have been popularized by wildlife documentary makers and National Geographic people and so forth. But in practice, on the ground, forests have a very, very complex history. In large parts of the world, forests were, as a legal administrative category, they were set aside by colonial governments.
Right.
And when they were doing this, they didn't, actually go on the ground and see, what the people were doing there. They lived there, they farmed these lands, and then so suddenly there was this conflict at the root of the origin of these forest land regimes, And because of this colonial history, most of the contemporary projects of forest, wildlife, and biodiversity conservation, they are sort of linked to a variety of land rights conflicts. And these land rights conflicts then lead to human rights violations in a large number of cases. And if I can bring in some data here, in general, the data that has been collected by international think tanks such as the Rights and Resources Institutions and others shows that an estimated 750 million to about 1.5 billion people are affected by these kinds of land rights conflicts in forest areas.
Wow.
So because of these conflicts, it's virtually impossible to think about and to pursue forest biodiversity and wildlife conservation without first addressing these forest and land rights conflicts.
Right.
So and even worse, if we promote environmental conservation without addressing these conflicts, because of this particular history that I talked about, the conservation interventions end up aggravating these land rights conflicts. And so if you think about, for example, say, United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, the 2030 SDGs, they include separate goals of protecting land rights and promoting environmental conservation. Now, SDGs, the way it is set up, it provides no means to think about what if two of these goals run into conflict with one another.
Right.
So this book shows an approach to sort of looking at these interrelated questions of land rights conflicts and environmental conservation. So now we can come to sort of talk about these three countries.
Right. So to go back to my question, why did you choose these three countries in order to understand better the social conflict and environment conservation that is happening?
Right. So this is a very important question. So beyond the generic problem of forest land conflicts that I explained a moment ago, there is a great deal of variation in how different governments all over the world have dealt with these tensions between social justice and environmental conservation. But many studies of forest policy and forest conflicts are so narrowly, sometimes you need to be narrowly focused, but they don't allow us to understand these kinds of big questions, and especially in a comparative perspective. Right? So these three countries, all of them have large areas of forest land. All of them are important countries in the context of the global and international negotiations over forest governance and the climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation processes and so forth. But all of these countries also have long-standing and yet to be resolved questions of land rights. Right. At a different level. So studying these countries allows me to, sort of come at this problem, which is more generic, but then we can, take these three countries and address this tension between social justice and environmental conservation within the context of these specific countries.
But how do you analyze the outcomes related to this environmental conservation and social justice trade-off that you're talking about in these countries?
Right. So, let me add one more thing about these three countries, which will obviously come to the mind of people who know about, particularly about Mexico, is that Mexico is different from Tanzania and India because of the history of the revolution that happened in the first decade of the 20th century, right? And so obviously, that revolution, because it didn't happen similarly in India and Tanzania, you could say that how can you compare Mexico to India and Tanzania?
Right.
And so the methodology that I adopt, first of all, I show that while the peasant revolution was extremely important and it shaped the further development of forest land regimes in Mexico, the revolution in itself was not sufficient to put in place the widespread and significant land redistributions that happened in the 40s and between 1940s and 40 and late 60s. And so politics actually comes into picture when we try to link the history of revolution to the contemporary state of forest and land regimes. So in that sense, instead of ignoring these differences, I study these differences beginning the colonial period, and try to examine how the specific type of colonial history that each of these countries had, what difference did it make to the contemporary forest and land regimes? And so, I bring the reader up to the speed right from the times of colonial era to the sort of post-independence and post-revolutionary era to show how you can think about these three countries on a comparative level.
Okay.
And so then, but if you're looking at three countries, you're starting from the colonial era, and you're looking at international politics, national politics, and sometimes subnational outcomes. How do you keep all of this together, right?
Right.
That becomes a question, especially for researchers and scholars who may want to do something similar. And so to address that particular challenge, I developed a political economy of institutions framework. Now,
Okay.
we won't get into the details of that framework, but let me point out that the framework allows us to carry out a disciplined, well-bounded, and theoretically informed inquiry into these big questions across these three countries and across time scale and across international, national, and local level.
Yeah, that's a pretty large scale that we are talking about across. I think across half of the world. That's what we are talking about. Yeah, without going into how you did it, probably for the general people, let's talk about what are the main findings of the book, so we have a perspective of what we are getting into.
Right. So let me add one more thing about the colonial history that I was talking about. The one big difference that happened between these three countries during because of the colonial regime was that in Mexico, because of the specific colonial history that I analyze in the book, Mexico did not get a very strong, overpowering, centralized national forest service. India has probably the strongest, most well-organized, professional, and elite forestry service at the national level.
Right.
And it controls 23% of the land in the country.
Right.
Now, Tanzania, because of its own colonial history, it has a slightly different kinds of national forestry regime, which is that it has a relatively more divided jurisdiction. So you have the what was called as the Forestry and Beekeeping Division, which was which is approximately similar to India's Forest Service. But then you have a separate National Park Service.
Okay.
So the moment you have a divided jurisdiction, it creates a different kind of politics, as opposed to when you have a monolithic national forestry agency, as opposed to Mexico, which doesn't have a national agency like that, right? So then we get into, how do these differences then shape the post-independence, post-colonial era development of forest policy and politics and so forth. Right. So I take readers through those connections. I don't sort of jump over these big differences. And as I said, the goal is learning from Elinor Ostrom and other teachers that have taught me. As you go along, you have to show to the reader why is it that you are able to make these claims. Right.
Right.
So the two main findings of the book that will be of interest to academics as well as policymakers and social activists is, first, I show that the balance of social justice and environmental conservation, it depends on whether the indigenous and other forest dependent people who are who rely on these resources, whether they are part of the political and policy process or not. Right.
Okay.
And if they are part of the policy process and political process, the balance of social justice and environmental conservation is more likely than in countries where this balance, where these groups are not part of the political process. So then, obviously the question is, what determines if these groups are part of the political process, they are part of the policy process.
Right.
To answer that sort of secondary question, I show that they can become part of the political process and policy process if countries have what I refer to as mechanisms of political intermediation.
Okay.
Now, again, this concept, I won't go into the details, but it draws on scholarship in political science, development studies, and policy studies. But I show that when you have these kinds of political intermediation mechanisms, which link forest-dependent people, indigenous people, and the dominant political parties and political leaders, you are more likely to see governments putting in place policies that are responsive to the concerns and questions of environmental justice, environmental conservation, and social justice. And if you mix the two together, then you get environmental justice, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the sort of first main finding, that if political elites are forced because of the political economic circumstances that I talked a little bit about in my previous comments, if the political elites are forced to accommodate indigenous and forest dependent groups in the political process, as has been the case in Mexico, partly because of its revolutionary history, but partly also because of the nature of the politics in the country, then you are more likely to see forest and wildlife and biodiversity conservation policies and programs that respect the rights of indigenous people, that respect both the land rights and forest rights of forest-dependent people.
I had a quick question on that. Basically, like when I was doing internship at Indian Institute of Forest Management like 16 years ago, and I went to this Chotanagpur district in Bihar, where a lot of tribal villages were protecting their forests themselves. And like the government was not even involved in that protection.
Right.
And what happened is that after some time, the government came in and said, oh, okay, this is a great institution, and let us institutionalize it. And they started creating these forest protection committees in those villages. And then it all became mechanical. And there were people who were like very sympathetic to the government, and they started becoming the rising force in those institutions. And again, there was motivation behind the original forest protection that these people were doing.
Right.
So how do you balance that?
Right. So, this is in the social science literature, this is, often referred to as elite capture. So you have a homegrown, organic, grassroots, bottom-up mobilization in favor of forest protection. And then governments or NGOs bring in additional resources. And as soon as there are resources worth capturing, you have the powerful actors in the community or in the nearby areas and in government. They capture these processes.
Right.
They want to control these benefits. And so this again relates to how much power can these non-elites, even within the local community, you can have relatively elite people versus non-elite. If the non-elite common citizens at the local level, they are able to bring in some kind of counterpower so that these elites, cannot do what they want to do, then, it will be difficult for these elites to capture these programs. Now, how do these local people get this power, right? So one way, in fact, we are, along with some colleagues, we are right now working on a special issue of the journal World Development. We are looking precisely at these kinds of questions. We are examining how the national and international programs of economic reforms or forest reforms or land reforms, they become something different at the local level depending on what the local social political context is, right? And so, one is...
Let me not digress a lot on this, but what was the second findings of your book?
Right. So just to right. So without going into the details, just to conclude, you can think about the non-governmental organizations, the political parties, the unions, and
Right.
regional federations, all kinds of actors intervening in this local arena
Right.
and keeping a watch over local elites.
Hmm.
Right. So if you happen to have these kinds of multiple centers of local and regional powers and counterpowers, then you're likely to see a more vibrant community forestry program, for example.
Hmm. Okay.
So but let's sort of talk about, because we are talking about a comparative context,
Right.
we can take the same sort of idea to the national level. So in the first part of the finding, I mentioned how you have to have these mechanisms of political intermediation for the political elites and government agencies to be forced to do the right thing, right? To share benefits and to make
Right.
sure that people's rights are recognized and so forth. Now, if this argument is true, can you show the same argument operates in the context of a contemporary and concrete policy process, right? So, because what I do in the first part of the book is to take the reader through this long process of colonial and post-colonial and contemporary political context and political parties and all of that, right? And these are sort of big, large-scale processes, and they are not so concrete in many ways. But if we pick one particular policy and we show that if all these three countries were trying to implement the same policy, but because of the political intermediation mechanisms and the political processes that I'm describing,
Right.
the same program became something different in each of these three countries, then you gain sort of policy leverage, right? Then you understand how this kind of analysis can be useful for policy analysis. And so in the second part of the book, I use two different kinds of policy processes. One is the recent processes of land reforms, and I say reforms in quote unquote because different governments tried to do it differently, and they had different types of agendas. They framed it in different ways, but at the fundamental level, there were some kind of attempts to create institutional change in the context of land rights in these forest areas. So that was the first sort of process that I looked at.
Right.
Second national level policy that I want to talk more about, to take a couple of more minutes, is this international carbon forestry program, which is called RED Plus, REDD Plus. It's
Right.
it's the international program for reduced emissions from deforestation and avoided forest degradation. The analysis in the book shows that if you have national forest policy making processes and jurisdictions which provides power and authority to multiple agencies, which can create some kind of counter checks against the other agencies. So if you have a divided jurisdiction at the national level,
Right.
coupled with the mechanisms of political intermediation that I talked about earlier, then you are going to have a RED Plus policy proposal which makes credible commitment about sharing of benefits of this international policy process with forest dependent people.
Okay.
And if those two things happen, the divided jurisdiction coupled with the mechanisms of political intermediation, then you will have the land rights and forest rights of forest dependent people captured within this national policy proposal related to this international program of RED Plus. Right. So we systematically analyze these policy proposals and the process through which these policy proposals were developed. And I show that these are pretty important predictors of which country will promote policies that are relatively more responsive to concerns of social justice and environmental conservation, and which other country will simply pretend. They will use lots of hot air kind of language,
Right.
but if you read carefully and if you read between the lines, you can see that they are equivocating, right? They are sort of, making all these noises, but they are not really serious about actually granting those rights and benefits to the people. And I show, again, through a systematic comparison of these policy processes, how you can actually tell that if a government is more or less serious, right? So again, to sort of come back to this analytical approach, that I don't want the reader to take my word on the face value, and rather than looking at the evidence and getting a convincing answer about whether this kind of explanation about the seriousness with which these governments are implementing these policies can be objectively analyzed, right? Because
Right.
you have all of these debates about, how can you critique somebody's intentions, right? So you're actually trying to show that these governments are making all these noises, but not everybody has the same level of seriousness behind these policy proposals.
And I see that your book is pretty important for policy making, because I have this quote here from Jairam Ramesh, former Minister of Environment and Forest, who is saying a hugely significant contribution to our understanding of the social justice dimensions of environmental policy. Kashwan brings in the third dimension of economic growth, as well as giving this book a distinct niche. So I understand the policymakers are studying this book. Do you think that they are also trying to implement some of your findings of the book?
Well, I mean, we will see. The goal of a researcher or an academic is to sort of produce an argument,
right,
and show why this is convincing, and to show why this is important. And then try to make these kinds of efforts to bring these findings to the notice of young environmental leaders as are present in our conversation today, and also policymakers. And you hope at some level, these discussions, this kind of research contributes to ongoing debates and discussions, right? So this is not the only book that is doing similar kind of effort. But you hope that
another question is, what does this finding means to social movements? Political, I understand. What about social movements?
Right. So, I have, social movements are always lurking in the background of my argument, and I don't directly make an argument about their role per se, but it has lots of implications. And before I say that, let me say that, it's a very complex terrain. And so, whatever I say need not be deemed as my considered professional opinion on this, because, obviously I'll need to talk much more if I have to be nuanced about it.
Right.
But having said that, what you see in comparing these three countries, and then, reading evidence from other countries, is that social movements have at least two very concrete and important roles in this process. One is to mobilize people and communities so that they can become a constituency with a voice, right? Because poor people do not get voice on their own. Political process tend to, in different countries to different extent, politics tends to marginalize poor people, especially indigenous and forest dependent people. So social movement bring in and mobilize them and make their voice count. So that's their first role. But if you stop at that point where, we have mobilized and we have voiced our concern, it doesn't always get translated into policy outcomes and programmatic outcomes and effective implementation of those outcomes on the ground. So the second role that is there for social movements is to actually engage with the policymakers, to continue to pressurize them, and to continue to sort of, engage with the actual policy process in the actual design of these programs and policies and land rights programs. And here, there's been tremendous amount of scholarship coming out of Latin America, also from other regions, but especially Professors Jonathan Fox and Anthony Bloomington, who have shown in the context of Mexico and Ecuador and other Latin American countries that these linkages between social movements, between regional federations of peasants and forest dependent people, linkages between these social groups and social movements on the one hand, and the policymakers and policymaking process on the other hand, is an extremely important part, which hasn't received the kind of attention it actually deserves. So this is the part that I focus quite a bit on, to show how these linkages actually led to concrete outcomes on the ground in these three countries.
But is it true that these lessons apply to all other countries as well?
Right. So, one aspect of being sort of humble and being sort of respectful of the complexity that happens from one country to another country is that, you do not want to make big claims about countries that you have not studied, right? So I don't, very easily say this, but because, this obviously is an important question, let me sort of add just a couple of sentences here. I do think that first, the framework that I provide, it will provide a way for other scholars to do similar kind of studies in other countries.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I do argue and show that this framework is sort of capable of incorporating the most important parts of complex political economic context and institutional politics that will help us understand similar kind of outcomes and comparative analysis in other countries and other contexts. But if you look at a regional level also, the next study that I want to do is to sort of look at the regional level and see what are the big differences between, say, Latin America versus Africa versus Asia, and for sure, there are lots of variations within these regions. But if you sort of step back and look at these regions, you can also see patterns that are common to each of these regions, and they are distinctly different from the other regions. So the goal is to promote these kinds of discussions and to collaborate with other like-minded scholars and social activists and so forth to try and sort of get to the next step, which is to say, okay, let's try and see if we can explain outcomes in other countries in other contexts by doing some more work in near future.
So let's go global now. So does these findings have any relevance for the ongoing negotiations that we are having at the Paris Climate Change Agreement and other international agreement that we are having?
Right. So, this is slightly unfortunate in a sense. So, when we went from the COP22 in Paris to COP23 in Marrakesh, that was the time right in the middle of the 23rd Conference of Parties in Marrakesh, Morocco. The results of the US presidential elections were being announced on the same evening that the delegates from all over the world were gathered in Morocco, right? And so immediately it hits upon this discussion in a very important way and makes visible this point in rather unfortunate ways that domestic politics, especially in large countries, which includes the three countries that I study, but also other large countries, is extremely important because it can actually affect the international environmental agreements directly. What comes out of these agreements also depends on domestic policies. But probably even more important, let's say international community gets lucky, it gets its act together, and it can create these wonderful international environmental agreements, just as the Paris Agreement was to some extent. The actual implementation of climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation programs happens at the local level, right? So therefore, climate change is called a global issue, right? It's global and local at the same time.
Right.
And because of that, the implementation of international environmental agreements and the real progress towards the goals of environmental conservation and social justice happens only when the domestic politics works in a certain way so that everybody is interested in actual outcomes rather than, grabbing what comes out of the international processes. Right? And whether national leaderships, national agencies, and national ministries are actually interested in bringing about these changes on the ground, or they're merely interested in grabbing the aid or the money or the material support that comes through these international environmental agreements, it will depend largely based on the political processes and policy processes that I describe in the book, right?
Okay.
So it provides a direct link between these international agreements and the sort of local level and national level implementation of these agreements.
I think I have monopolized a lot of your time. Let me now open questions to our audience right here. We have an august audience from all over the world who are trying to question you. Let me do it one by one. Let's start with Nishad. Hey, Nishad.
Did you mute? Okay.
Yeah. Hey, Nishad, welcome to this episode. We are talking to Dr. Kashwan. Do you have any questions for him? I think you have muted your mic if you want to. We still can't hear you. I don't know what is happening, but I still can't hear you. So we'll figure this out. And let me go to Alona. So let me see if I can talk to her. Hey, Alona.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, it's great. Yes, so thank you for this really interesting talk and yes, the outline of your book. Yes, we have already talked about it a few months ago, and I'm really interested in your results, and I find it also very relevant for many other areas, for sustainability policy, climate change policy, and mitigation policy. Like probably the kind of the most interesting finding that I see relevant for my work is this issue of how those kind of traditionally kind of people who have no voice, kind of underclass, if I could call them, like people who are, the poor, who depend on the kind of the most basic natural resources, the forest, and they are not a part of the traditional political process. And how come that they managed to get together and exercise pressure on the elites? So, like, if you could describe this process, like, was there, the cases that you researched, was there someone from outside who was helping them, or maybe, I know, some educated children belonging to that underclass, as I call it, they led the process? I'm just wondering, how, what can we learn from this, how this kind of the masses that have no influence can change the political process? You have to turn on your microphone, I think. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Ilona. This is a really important question. One, of course, as I mentioned a little bit in my comments, this is partly, part of this is historical, right? So in some countries and some places, you have a tradition of local resistance. You have a tradition of peasant movements and labor movements and, movements of forest-dependent people and so forth. So, for outsiders, who are environmental NGOs or academic groups or even international community, I think one important thing to do is to actually look out for already existing groups and try and connect them explicitly and directly to the policymaking process, right? So, but then obviously not all places have these kinds of movements. And so then the question is, do you have other kinds of related interventions, around, say, for example, microfinance, or say, local economic development program, or some water resources development program, or whatever, so that's the second layer of opportunities for social activists and international environmental activists to try and connect at the grassroots level. So I think the best strategy is to try and find out existing groups, whether they are directly related to these questions or not. If they are groups that are locally organized and have some history of working together, not just on the sort of, programs of economic development and natural resource management, but sometimes also on political questions of, say, fighting for local wages, right? So in many parts of the world, you have people getting together to assure, decent working conditions and those kinds of things, agricultural inputs. So I mentioned the work of Latin American scholars who have looked at how, say, food councils in Mexico or these agricultural cooperatives in the Ecuadorian highlands, they have become instrumental as political entities, as groups that are organizing local communities and then linking them to a variety of different kinds of regional and national level debates about these questions. But you're right. I think the climate change community at a large scale and in a systematic way has yet to make those connections. And so I would say, it's our responsibility to sort of try and engage more directly with those groups on the ground.
Let me now try to go to Mawa. Mawa is a doctoral researcher at Department of Forest Science, University of Helsinki, Finland. Hey, Mawa, let me see if, can you speak, and let's see if we can hear you or not. Hello? Yeah, I think there is a problem here too. I cannot hear you. Yeah. Yeah, I think there is something, your mic is not picking up from your computer. Let me see if I can go back to that again.
CK, can you try and describe the sort of the icon, the...
Yeah, there's a mic icon right there, and you have to click it. But I understand there's you have to also set it up in the computer in a way that...
I was just wondering if they cannot talk, maybe they could type their questions, because there's this chat box. So maybe if it,
Right. So if you can do that, and we can just ask Prakash Kashwan directly. If you can just type on the chat. And let's see if Matthew Buki can...
CK, so Mawa, there's an icon on the left-hand side of your screen, which is like a chat icon. If you click on that icon, you will see the window for typing in the message. Right?
Right.
Okay.
So if you can type the message, basically Prakash can answer you.
And maybe in the meanwhile, we can go to Matthew, if you can speak up.
And let's try if we can hear Matthew too or not. Yeah, there's some problem going on, but I can hear Ilona, so I don't...
Yes, so I can ask one more question.
Yes.
Just to kind of occupy the time. But yes, I always have to click this microphone item on, so maybe I know others are doing it, but I had to click it on and turn on the microphone, and then it worked. But I can ask a short follow-up question, and maybe the others will type their questions. So just kind of a short question. So like you mentioned, for the climate change movement or mitigation policy, so you should look for those local groups who are there. And what do you think are those groups interested in climate change issues? Like you mentioned, farmers, cooperatives, microfinance, and so on. Do you think there's some potential that they could be sort of, taken on board and convinced that, okay, we have to go for mitigation and or sustainability transformation and topics like this? Do you think it's possible to connect to them?
Right. Part of this also depends on how we frame the question of climate change mitigation and so forth, right? So as long as we are only talking about carbon and emissions and all of that, we are actually taking away from our opportunities of engaging with local actors. Because, and again, there's a lot of social science research which shows that this framing can either, depending on how you frame the question, it can either alienate local people and can make them your adversary, because they then believe that you are actually capturing this issue to do something that is going to undermine their interest, as opposed to helping them do what they want to do, which is go about their lives in a dignified and respectful manner, right? Because questions of climate change are also questions of water resources. They're also questions of agricultural land productivity and rights to land, rights to forest land, for example. And if we want to lock away forest areas and other natural areas in the name of, stocking carbon emissions in those forests, we are obviously creating, the same kind of conflicts that I mentioned earlier, right? But if we want to believe that, these issues are also, the issues of agriculture, water, and land are also of concern to the global community, because we are all in this together, right? Then we will make sure that we are thinking specifically about those local issues and not only about emissions and trade and market-based interventions and so forth. If I can intervene real quick, and I make this sort of point about just as we talked about theories, the policies and programs and how you can frame in different ways. Many a times academic theories are also informed about one or the other type of understanding of what it means to talk about climate change, what it means to talk about local forest protection, right? And I won't go into the details, but if you compare, say, the market-based programs for reduction of sulfur dioxide emissions here in the US, and if you compare the reduction of emissions because of forest degradation and deforestation, the way in which the stakes of actors who were already invested in these processes, so sulfur dioxide on the one hand, and forest land consumption and forest questions on the other hand, theoretically, I actually demonstrate that the stakes that are otherwise conceptually similar in these two processes, they are treated very differently. The stakes of industries which were already polluting sulfur dioxide emissions are respected, and these stakes are given a place in the policy process. But in the REDD+, the dominant paradigm of carbon forestry, the stakes of people who are farming in forest land have no place at all, right? And so anyway, I won't get into the details, but I describe in the concluding chapter that
we have some questions that Nisad has typed. You can see that.
Right. So let me quickly read the first question by Nishad. And he says, I can read it out for the listeners as well. As mentioned in the book, does the democratic setup is sole indicator of how good is that groups are protected? Right. So that's a very important question, Nisha. Thanks. First, we have to think about whether you are considering democratic setup in a formal manner, right? So you have elections and you have parliament, and if you also include judiciary, so all of the formal arrangements, right? As opposed to how they actually work in practice. So these are two different ways of thinking about and looking at democratic setup. So if one were to think about the formal arrangements, as they exist on the law books and rule books, then that is not a good predictor of how the rights of social groups and the concerns of environmental conservation are protected in practice, right? Because look, that way India is considered to be a far more stronger democracy compared to, say, Mexico, which was known as a bureaucratic authoritarian state for a long, long time. And only recently, it has been included in the categories of countries that are called democratic. But what we are trying to sort of look in the book and the related research that I've done elsewhere is that how are the actual interactions between social groups, political groups, and the policymakers unfold in practice, right? And in the book, I try to show that this, the actual process need not be shrouded in the mystery of, we can't understand this because in practice, everything happens in a different and complicated way and all of that. But I show that if you look at it from the political economy of institutions framework I proposed, you can actually systematically study the practice of policymaking, the practice of democracy, the practice of engagement between social groups and policymakers. And so if you look at the practice, then the schematic differences that I describe in the book, those differences are good predictors of whether you will get outcomes that are respectful of rights and are cognizant of the need for environmental conservation or not, right? So I hope that answers your question, at least the first part of the question, and I'm going to read the second part, in which you're saying the human rights issues were always a key demand from civil society, which myself campaigns. You've been part of the Conference of Parties and part of the climate group of youth advocates of climate change, and we, Nishad and others, have worked with fellow indigenous groups from various countries, but they are underrepresented in the process, right? So how do we ensure that the underrepresented groups are represented in the policy process? Now, one proposal has been, for example, if you look at the IUCN's recently concluded World Conservation Congress, they have tried to bring indigenous people, representatives of indigenous people on the board, on their board. So basically, certain selected leaders from these groups are part of the board of IUCN or other processes that they are, and that's one way of doing it, right? To me, that's that may be effective, but historically we see that those kinds of processes have not been very effective, right? But it doesn't mean that they will not be effective in future. You can change how you account for their views, and you can change what kind of people you bring on board and all of that, right? I have a second kind of suggestion, as I was talking in the context of the questions that Ilona asked a moment ago, which is that instead of trying to bring in selected leaders or, in addition to bringing in selected leaders into international policy making discussions and so forth, we also need to connect at different levels. We need to connect at national level. We need to connect at subnational level. We need to connect at local level, right? And fortunately, in almost all of the countries, there are national level federations of, indigenous and forest dependent people. So in India, for example, we have forest rights movement, there is, Forest People's Union, there is Campaign for Survival and Dignity, Rights and Resources have been connecting to these various groups, bringing them on into discussions. And then these groups take those discussions and those proposals down to the grassroots levels, right? So that's the multi-scale nested approach we sort of propose, which should also happen along with bringing some of these people into the international policy making processes.
We also have Mawa asking questions, if you can answer her.
Right, so Mawa has two questions. How do you think people's empowerment could contribute to addressing this issue of balance between conservation and social justice and economic development? Thank you, Mawa. That's a great question, and it's unfortunate that we don't have your actual literal voice in the process, but your voice is here. And so, as I mentioned, people's empowerment, if you think about this as a first step, would be to mobilize them, right? To get them together in the form of local community groups or social movements and so forth. And and then, to connect them to these processes that I was talking just a moment ago, right? The second part, which is equally important, is that when you have locally mobilized groups of people who are strong enough, they can actually influence the subnational and national level political process, right? So in the year 2004, between 2000 and 2004, I described how the political economic context in India suddenly became conducive to the emergence of the voice of indigenous people. And the social movements, to their great credit, they were able to tap into the effects of the economic reforms in the late 90s and early 2000, and the failure of the government to address the questions of economic equality and so forth. It created a political opportunity which the social movements tapped into, and they carried the masses along them. There were large-scale mobilizations and demonstrations and sit-ins and all of those. So they continuously pressurized political parties before the election, and they continued to pressurize the political leadership after the elections. And so I go through this process and I show how these connections are not just theoretical. It obviously, the idea comes from the theories of development studies and policy studies and political science. But then I'm able to show by using these examples that these kinds of connections actually make a lot of difference in real life, right? So that is the first part of how these mobilizations and their empowerment can make a difference. And then your second question is your framework suitable for a research on how social movement or conflict at local level contribute to citizenship engagement in decentralized forest management in countries like Burkina Faso? So, as you can imagine, we've already talked about so many different types of issues at different levels across time and all of that. And so I could not accommodate the direct links that I wanted to show between these political processes and the kind of institutional interventions of decentralized forest management that you're talking about. But I included in an appendix in the book, Appendix 5 actually, to show how the leadership between these different types of policy processes at local level, what kind of leaders do you get in any of these policy processes, right? So do you have the leaders who are wanting to capture the process, as opposed to leaders who are trying to, be a voice for their own community, right? So I actually have a statistical model to show that when you have leaders that have been co-opted by forestry agencies to some extent and who are interested in capturing local benefits, you actually see a failure of recognition of land rights at the local level, even when the national law actually permits such recognition, right? But on the other hand, when you don't have leaders who have been co-opted by forestry agencies, then you see a significant increase in the administration of land rights at the local level. And so that was one part. And second, at a slightly higher level, I'm able to show that these land reforms processes that each of these three countries undertook in the 90s and the 2000s also demonstrate the connections between the political process and the actual institutional policy process at the subnational level. Right? I hope that that answers your question to some extent.
If Matthew can hear us and we can talk to Matthew. Hello, Matthew.
Hello.
Yeah. Oh, great. So we can talk to you now.
Okay. Yeah, it's nice to join the conversation, in which from Prakash book, which is quite interesting analysis. So as I've been, hearing what Prakash has been saying, I have a couple of questions that have. Two questions are based on the Tanzania's case, but also I have a question which is like a general question, which I also have been thinking a lot lately. So my first question would be, these issues about social justice in conservation intervention have been quite discussed for some times. It's something that has been there in the academic discussion and the policy discussion and so on. But it seems that it hasn't been, going away, because social justice, there are still social injustices in conservation interventions, So my question is, what is the role of academics beyond academia in terms of trying to see how, conservation intervention work for social justice, So it's like, that is my first question. So Prakash, have you heard what I've asked? Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I can answer the first question and then
right?
and
then we can go on.
Right, and just for the sake of context here, Matthew is a Tanzanian citizen who's now pursuing his PhD in Denmark. So he is also familiar with the Tanzanian context. Right, Matthew. So as I said, first I think if as an academic, if we do our job well, and if we choose the kind of questions that really matter, and the finding answers to those questions would give at least enable us to think in productive ways about actual interventions. That's the first step, right? So I want to sort of underline this importance of well-structured, well-conducted academic studies. They are actually important not just for the sake of academic discussions, but also for informing actual policy interventions, right? Second, I would say, I think as many senior academics have been doing, there are multiple ways in which academics are actually becoming part of the policy debates, right? So they're writing blogs. I myself have written, even though, at my level of academic career, it's often not very advisable to spend your time on blogs and things like that. But I have still, wanted to do some, and I've done some kind of public engagement. But I think, there are portals such as Just Conservation, right? There are portals such as the Political Ecology blog Entitled, and there is another political ecology blog called Poland. So in many of these blogs, and especially, I want to sort of thank Just Conservation, and there are e-groups such as we have the Forest Rights group in India, and we have the Community Forestry Learning group in India, on which you have social activists, local activists, professionals, all kinds of different stakeholders, right? So engaging these various stakeholders through these modern means of, electronic communications and electronic writings is also an important part of, taking these debates forward. And the third part, I would say, as academics and who sometimes take on the role of consultants and as people who are advising policymakers, is to say that, not to chicken out when we have our own opportunity of actually making our voice count. We shouldn't worry so much about, political correctness and whether these issues that we are raising, whether they will make us sound like radicals who are not interested in engaging with policymakers, right? And so one of the things that I've tried to do to demonstrate that, raising questions of social justice on its own doesn't mean that you are undermining or are in any way lessening the importance of environmental conservation, right? Because conservation is important for administering social justice, and social justice is important for ensuring the success of conservation interventions, right? So we have to sort of, bring all of this together and use this whenever we get an opportunity to articulate these issues at some level.
I get to a point in terms of the institutional barriers, especially for junior academics in engaging outside of academia. I think that is quite an important point,
Right. And to some extent, I would say, I think it's also important for ourselves to give ourselves time to, hone our arguments and to make sure that we, have studied properly and we have spent enough time thinking about these questions. Right?
That's quite right. So my second question is based on your Tanzania's case, which as we've been talking in the past about these issues in Tanzania. So it's like I just wanted to know if you thought about it, or because I haven't read all of your books, so I don't know if this is something that you have written in the book, but it would also be just interesting to hear what you say about it. I think one thing that differentiates Tanzania from India and Mexico, apart from the things that we have said, is the past socialist ideology, because in the past, Tanzania used to be a socialist country.
Right.
Although it is still a socialist country in the constitution, but in practice, it is not.
Right. Right.
So I just wanted to know if you looked at it and how you think it shapes, the existing forest practices, processes, and politics in Tanzania.
Right. So no, I do. I actually spent one whole chapter on this question of the post-independence, post-colonial history in each of these three countries. And this socialist history is common to all of these three countries. So you had Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, we had Nehru and Indira Gandhi and other, old Congress leadership in India. And of course, you had President Cardenas in Mexico. And so what I show is that in this socialist or, so-called socialist attempts, the argument was that, let the government take control of resources, and about the villagization program that happened in Tanzania, and we had sort of not exactly the same but similar kind of centralization of authority and control over land and forest resources in India. This centralization of control over natural resources was done in the name of socialist program, because the argument was that government is best equipped to take control of these resources and then administer these resources in the interest of the masses, right? But I show, again, through very concrete evidence in terms of the resources allocated, the land that was centralized and what became of that land and all of that, because of the particular socialist context and the aura that surrounded leaders such as Nyerere and Nehru and Indira Gandhi, there was no opposition to these kinds of efforts. And as a result, what you had was that land, forest, and other natural resources were systematically taken away from local people and local community groups, and their powers and authority was vested in the hands of forestry agencies. And so that actually had quite the contrary effect of what was supposed to be the effect of these socialist regimes. And very quickly, because of the different kinds of history, colonial and post-colonial history in Mexico, even though there were some elites who were arguing for exactly the same kind of centralization of forest resources and so forth, because of the nature of politics, which was very different in Mexico, that centralization did not happen. And in fact, Mexico ended up redistributing large amounts of lands, more than 50% of agricultural land and nearly 75% of forest land is in the hands of peasant groups who are organized locally, and they continue to sort of, have a serious stake in these lands. And so you have this very successful, relatively very successful Mexican community forestry program, even though both India and Tanzania have also made claims of instituting these local community forestry programs that CK was mentioning earlier, but they have not become successful, both because of the political context and because of the nature of political leadership and political parties and so forth.
I think that's quite right, especially the last point on
right. So I look forward to hear your comments when you get a chance to read that chapter, because I think that's really interesting comparison.
Thank you all. It is like a very engaging discussion that we are having. Unfortunately, we have already run out of time. We tried to do it for an hour. We are an hour and 15 minutes right now.
Okay.
But this has been so engaging, and thank you all for coming this together. And Prakash, I cannot thank you much for getting out to all the professionals, not only to the professionals, to the general people. This is the forum. That's what we were talking about, Prakash, that now we should talk to the general people. We should talk you should go out and have coffee with the masses, with the grassroots people. You should go out and talk directly to them. Talk to them about climate change, about the real social movements, the real environmental conservation issues, so that people understand what's going on in the scientific world. And there's no glass ceiling between you and all of us. Right. the entire mission of this dayoutwith.com that we are trying to present to everyone. And each one of you who are here, all the professionals that joined to meet with me today, I want all of you to join our website, dayoutwith.com, and everyone else who is also listening, join there. And let's that website is all about booking time with you. So we'll book time with you with your fans. Basically, there are a lot of fans who want to be with you just because of the work that you are doing, and basically change themselves, emulate the best thing that we can do for the entire world. So that's pretty important. So and also Prakash has been very kind enough to give us some of his signed books that we are selling through that website. So if someone want like a really collectible book that we can cherish, you can have it right from that website, dayoutwith.com. Let me see if I can show you.
And CK, while you do that, if I can add one more comment real quick.
Certainly, go ahead, do that.
Right. So as we talked about earlier, our guests in this conversation, as well as others who are listening this, I hear a lot of echo somewhere.
Let me see.
Right. So if we want to organize these kinds of discussions with NGOs and social movements on topics and questions that may be relevant to a particular context,
certainly,
CK has promised to make available this platform, especially for, social activists and NGOs in the developing countries who may not have a lot of resources,
right,
to organize these kinds of discussions. And hopefully we'll do some more of this and use this platform in a very productive way so that we can make our own sort of contributions to debates and discussions. And thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming on.
For coming here today. And again, this is our website, dayoutwith.com. Just whenever you can come to the site, let's book time with professionals and let's directly talk with the professionals and not hear about all the fake news that is going on all around the world. Let's not just see Facebook and everything else and decide and make an opinion on important things like climate change and everything else. Let's talk to the professionals directly. And what I said, that if you talk to them, you can know your own happiness. That is the most important thing that we can do while talking to the professionals. So again, Prakash, if you have to add something before we close this broadcast, that would be great.
Matthew, Mawa, and Nishad for joining us and for asking these really important, interesting questions. And I'm hoping that we will continue these discussions in a variety of ways, on social media and through these platforms. And I really appreciate CK for you making this available to us and facilitating these conversations across borders. And this, I think, is really wonderful, and I hope many more people will make use of these opportunities.
So certainly, I invite everyone to write to me at dayoutwith.com, and we'll make this platform available to everyone. And we have direct one-to-one dialogues, one-to-many dialogues, and just spread it around the world so we can now directly be part of the change that we want to be. So again, thank you everyone for coming. Let me stop this broadcast right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.